Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 201. We have made it past the bicentenary, so this week the questions are taken from the Wednesday video on the Barbary States and guide 247, the guide to HMS Exeter of World War II. Snebby Webby asks, does severe damage have a lasting effect on the structural integrity of a ship after being repaired? It depends exactly how extensive the repairs are. So this is HMS Belfast after sailing out on not quite her maiden voyage, but near enough, and hitting a magnetic mine. As you can see, the damage was quite considerable. Now, if you patch up a ship to get it quickly back into action, just do the minimum to make it, make it watertight and not immediately twist apart in the open ocean, then yes, there will be a significant lasting effect on the structural integrity of the ship. But even if you do a more extensive repair, to a certain degree it will depend on what exactly is damaged. So you could have severe damage, for example, as in all of our superstructure has been erased. Now that's pretty bad. But fundamentally, if you rebuild the superstructure, assuming that the hull itself was mostly undamaged somehow, you're not really going to affect the long-term structural integrity of the ship. But if it's severe damage to the hull, especially to some of the more important load-bearing members like the keel, then you are going to have some effects much further down the line. Now, that's for two reasons. One is, of course, things like the keel or major frames of the ship are not necessarily designed to be cut at certain locations. Now, obviously, this isn't the age of sail, the early age of sail, where you could try and make a keel out of a single piece of timber, for at least for some of the smaller wooden ships. Even a HMS Belfast keel or whatever, it's not a single continuous piece of metal, but it will have been designed to be joined together at certain points and to be a continuous piece of metal at other points. And if the keel has been warped, for example, there is a cost decision of, right, do we detach the keel at the points where it's designed to be detached, or do we save time and money by cutting out only the actually visibly damaged part and then reattaching it there? So then you're creating additional joints, and the same thing for frames and so forth. You could be creating additional joints and additional weakness, plus of course the fact that things like the ship's frames and keel and other major structural members are designed to be laid down and assembled at a certain stage of the ship's construction. They're not necessarily designed to be easily replaceable whilst the ship is under the full load of, existing. So it may not be physically possible to exactly replicate what was originally there. And of course, especially in World War II and World War I, that kind of period, there may also be subtle distortions that you don't notice. Whole sections of the ship might have canted just a little bit off, and it may not even be the external hull, maybe fairly big parts of the ship internally twisted a little bit or whatever. And obviously that will change the way that load accumulates and stress accumulates on the ship in the long term, which will affect its structural integrity. And then you have the other part, which is a force strong enough to warp, bend, rip, and tear solid steel, like, say, a mine explosion, is going to put a huge amount of stress not just on the things that actually failed, but on the things that ostensibly didn't budge. And all components of a ship or an aircraft or a vehicle have a fatigue life cycle, i.e. they can only take so much stress, usually measured in loading and unloading, but depending on the component, sometimes measured in just continuous load as well, or varying load, that they can take up to a certain point before fatigue cracks and such like will cause it to fail. Now, if you put a ship through a massive traumatic loading event like, have a magnetic mine explode under the keel and the entire ship hog upwards, that's going to put almost every major load-bearing part of the ship, even stuff at the bow and stern, under a huge amount of stress, and that is going to shorten the ship's fatigue life cycle as compared to a sister vessel that was built in exactly the same way but didn't experience that event. Now, obviously, the exact severity of how much the fatigue life cycle is reduced by will depend on where in the ship the component is and how the load was transmitted to it. It's not necessarily going to be a direct correlation to the proximity of the explosion or whatever other event is causing the damage. So, you could have components that are, say, 50 foot from the last visible site of distortion, and they may be minimally affected in their fatigue life cycle, but you may have objects that are 150 foot from the final distortion of physical components, which are actually significantly more affected. And these days, there are ways of testing for that. Back in World War I, World War II, it was a much more limited field, and it would just be a case of, largely keep an eye on those, because if anyone actually even realizes it at the time, those things might fail a lot sooner than one expects. Plus, of course, we are talking in a perfect world where the maximal possible rebuild or repair is possible. Usually when a ship takes massive structural damage, it's in a war, at which point it's not necessarily possible to do all of that. They might, but even a relatively comprehensive repair is still going to leave bits and pieces that are not the same as they were before, which has additional issues. Scott Giles asks, were the German 11-inch guns on the Graf Spee that bad? One would expect direct hits by them to eventually cause a cruiser like Exeter to go boom, a bit like Jutland. So, Graf Spee carried three kinds of shells for her 11-inch gun. She carried AP shells, she carried nose-fused HE shells, and she carried based-fused HE shells. The difference between the two last being fairly obvious, but basically a nose-fused HE shell tends to detonate a little bit sooner than a base-fused one. Now, when she fought Ajax, Achilles, and Exeter, according to the records that survived afterwards, she fired off just over 2/3 of her entire magazine load, and most of that, the vast majority of that, was HE of some description. Partly, I guess, maybe they were saving the AP if something really big and nasty showed up, and partly also because 11-inch AP, even Graf Spee's 11-inch AP, which was barely improved from World War I AP, probably would have had a similar issue to that which plagued a lot of the Japanese ships at the Battle of Samar, i.e. in a lot of places probably would have just gone straight through the ships and out the other side, which wouldn't have done as much damage as the nose or base fused HE, which obviously has a considerably larger bursting charge to begin with and would actually detonate either on or shortly within the ships in question. The flip side to that is that whilst an HE bombardment is capable of knocking out systems quite quickly and efficiently, it obviously doesn't penetrate anywhere near as deeply as AP, so the chances of either of the two HE types reaching the magazines of Exeter were actually fairly low, compounded, of course, by the fact that the British had learned a few lessons from World War I and the more exposed areas, like, well, as you can see, the amount of damage that Exeter's turrets took here, they weren't having the ammo handling issues, so it's very, very, very unlikely that a hit to one of Exeter's turrets would send flash down into the magazines, which is probably what killed more than one battlecruiser at Jutland. So, you have Exeter unlikely to explode from anything but a magazine hit, and because it's mostly, if not entirely, being shot at with HE, the shells are very unlikely to hit the magazine, therefore the ship's not going to explode. This kind of highlights one of the slight issues with the Graf Spee's armament, in that the 11-inch shells obviously carry a fair bit of power compared to an 8-inch or a 6-inch, but with only 6 guns, they weren't able to land enough HE hits to cause the ships to drop out of action quickly. I mean, eventually Exeter had to give up, but it did take quite a while. And it was also too powerful, at least it seems by the German estimations, even with a relatively low velocity 11-inch shell, to use the AP because of the aforementioned straight through and through issues. This is one of the big conundrums, because the other thing is also cruisers are built relatively tough. So, an 11-inch HE shell on a destroyer, sure, that'll put it down, but you have this weird middle ground when it comes to 7 to 10,000 ton cruisers, where if you're going to hit them with heavy shells, i.e. 11-inch, 12-inch, etc., if you're going to hit them with HE, you need to hit them with a reasonable number, i.e. you need at least 8 or 9 guns, not 6. And if you're going to hit them with AP, you have to get relatively lucky to avoid some R situations, which again is why larger numbers of guns can work. And so I say it kind of highlights one of the slight weaknesses of the Deutschland type design, in that yes, in theory they can batter an opponent quite badly, but they don't quite have enough guns to really be quite as effective as they thought they were going to be. But then again, that's also a limitation of the displacement. Josh Thomas Moore asks, 360-degree turning turrets. They were fitted to a few destroyers, but did anyone fit them to anything larger or have any plans to do so? They did show up in a number of ships larger than destroyers, although by the vast majority not intentionally. So you can see here, HMS Nelson, also of course their sister ship HMS Rodney had this feature, and you can see B turret would be able to do a 360 rotation. Although, as I said, this isn't like a deliberate design choice. This is just simply the fact that by having B turret super firing over A and C turret immediately behind B, back on A turret's level, there's nothing to stop B turret going spinning round and round and round. The Littorio class, their aft turret, main battery turret, could probably do a 360 if you elevated the guns high enough, or you didn't mind knocking out a small piece of superstructure that's just immediately behind them, but otherwise has a relatively clear angle of rotation. Similarly, you can imagine with some of the Japanese heavy cruisers that had a similar elevated B turret arrangement, or possibly even a C turret arrangement, although with the Atagos probably not so much, but certainly with something like the Megamis it would be possible. The main issue why it's not usually designed for in larger ships is that obviously as gun caliber increases, so does the gun length, and at that point having a gun that can do a full 360 will mean that by keeping it clear of obstructions, you've either cut back your superstructure, which most people don't want to do, or if you've got the minimum possible superstructure already, then to have a gun that can do a full 360 means you've got to position that gun's mounting much further forward or much further aft than you would otherwise have to, which means that if you've got a series of guns, you are reducing the number of guns that you can fit before you run out of beam. Or if it's a single gun turret fore or aft, then you are positioning it, let's say, further forward, which means the weight effects for hogging and sagging are going to be increased, and the available width, again, on the beam for protection is going to be reduced. So you're basically making the ship less efficient for the sake of having a 360 rotation. On destroyers, having a 360 rotation was perhaps a little bit more important, so where they could get it, they would, because destroyers are expected to fight very fast, very manoeuvrable actions, usually at relatively close range, whereas for cruisers or capital ships, in theory it was possible that you might have to undertake a manoeuvre, or the enemy might undertake a manoeuvre against you, whereby they cross over from one side to the other. But between, especially on capital ships, the relatively low rate of fire, and even on cruisers, the fact that you're usually fighting at very, very long range, it would be much better to have a much more compact gun turret layout where any 360-degree turns are coincidental to the design rather than purposeful, in order to maximise the amount of protected space that you can have, i.e. they maximise the thickness over that protected space, which increases your chances of survivability a lot more than just having a 360-degree capable gun would. This is the other problem, is if you have a gun that is positioned further forward, then that means the magazines are further forward, which means your armour belt has to be longer, which means the armour belt either weighs more or has to be thinner. Pirit Skenya asks, I have a more technical question. Would it have been possible for the Japanese Navy to refit the Furutaka and Aoba classes as light cruisers with the Megami's triple 155mm turrets? And would that have made them useful light cruisers? It seems to me that having 9 6-inch guns would be more useful at that point than 6 8-inch guns, as they could deliver a heavier broadside more often, and it would give the Japanese Navy a somewhat competent set of light cruisers, not leaving them solely with 5.5-inch armed World War I era cruisers, and then later on the Aganos. In theory, the main problem I can foresee is that actually the triple 6-inch mounts that were taken off the Megamis, the turrets actually weigh a fraction more than the twin 8s that replaced them, and therefore, unlike going from triple 6 to twin 8, which is what was done with the Megamis, if you went from twin 8 down, quote unquote, to triple 6, you might actually end up being about, for the Aobas at least, about 30 tons per turret overweight, so that's nearly 100 tons total extra mass. Now that might not sound like too much, considering you're talking about a ship that weighs several thousand tons, but 100 tons of top weight, which is what it is, it's above the deck, that could have some fairly serious stability implications, especially given that this is a Japanese interwar period vessel. There would have to probably be some sacrifices, fairly significant ones, made elsewhere on the ship just for weight and balancing issues. But otherwise, in theory, it could be done, because when the Furutakas were refitted, they had the same twin 8-inch mounts installed as were installed on the Megamis, so that would suggest that barbette width is not necessarily a problem. The Aobas have a slightly older mount, but with some refit it could work. Now, as for whether it would be a good idea, weight issues and cost issues aside, well, yes, in hindsight probably, because as you mentioned, you're delivering more shells quicker than with the 8-inch, but at the same time, it's one of those things that in hindsight would have been a reasonable idea, as much as the Aobas and Furutakas contributed in any significant way to the war. But in practice, at the time, remember the Japanese were still wedded almost to the end of the war to the Kantai Kessen, at which point having heavier shells in order to inflict the maximum possible damage on potentially enemy heavy cruisers and so forth was seen as better. So, I mean, the fact that they designed the Megamis with the 666 and then rearmed them to the twin 8s because they wanted even more heavy cruisers kind of speaks to that desire. So, yes, in theory, it probably would have made them marginally more effective warships, but in practice, the Japanese were probably never going to do it. Augment Failure asks, battle cruisers were originally designed to hunt lesser cruisers, and so were armed with 12-inch guns. Surely this was enough firepower for the job they were designed for, and yet we see armament increases to 16 inches in a decade or so. Why chase the armament of dreadnoughts when they were never meant to face them? Discounting the Kaiserliche Marine and related, are the Kaiserliche Marine battlecruisers the first fast battleships, as they break the battlecruiser model by emphasising speed and armour over firepower? Now, I kind of actually discussed this on Armchair Admirals, which returned on, well, at the time that this is being released a couple of weeks ago. And in my view, and I do stress this is my view, a few other historians do agree with me, but it's by far from a universal thing. I tend to divide battle cruiser development into 4 categories. So the first category is where you have the Invincibles and Indefatigables, and this is where the first part of your question comes in. They're designed to hunt down lesser cruisers, and they're armed with 12-inch guns. Yes, that's plenty of firepower for the job. You then have a second tranche of battlecruisers. Now, these are the battlecruisers that are designed with a view to other battlecruisers existing and the possibility they may have to fight them. This is where you see the German battlecruisers as a whole in World War One, and where you see the Splendid Cats, and to a degree, at least after their refits, Renown and Repulse. Renown can be seen here in her World War One configuration. You then have a third tranche of battlecruisers, which actually have very, very, very few representatives. In terms of representatives actually built, you only have Hood. Congo, by the way, falls into the second tranche. Hood represents a third tranche where it is literally and arguably, a fast battleship. In the terms of the spec is similar protection to the last lot of battleships, similar armament, in fact exactly the same armament, just faster. And then you get a fourth, chronologically speaking, tranche of battleships, which is battlecruisers, which is represented by things like the G3s, the Lexingtons, and the Amagis, where you start to see what a lot of people would commonly think of as the battlecruiser paradigm of slightly lesser firepower with speed and lesser armour. In the Lexington and Margie's cases, they're using the same guns as the proposed battleships. The Royal Navy tries to do that with things like K2 and K3, etc., but eventually settles on 16-inch guns, which ironically is the same as the Lexingtons and the Margie's, but is not the same as the battleship firepower because you have 18-inch planned on the N3s. So, that's the kind of a very messy fourth tranche at that point. It'd be much easier if the N3s had been designed with 16-inch guns, but never mind. So the reason why the armament increases from 11 and 12-inch to 12-inch and 13.5-inch and 13.4-inch and then 15 and then 16-inch is because the battlecruisers post-Indefatigable are not just designed to hunt down other cruisers, they are also designed to fight their own kin, and to a certain extent also potentially fight in the battle line. Exactly how much in the battle line depends on the exact navy and the exact type of ship. They're not designed to just sub in for battleships. They are kind of a fast wing. They can stand in the battle line if necessary, but usually the ideal, even in the German Navy, is for them, as I say, to be a fast wing to help either head off the enemy, pursue the enemy, or provide backup firepower. They're not supposed to be front and centre, though. Now, as regards the second part, I have seen people advance this idea that the Kaiserliche Marine battlecruisers are the first fast battleships. I don't agree. And I don't agree for a number of reasons. Yes, obviously they are faster, but so are battlecruisers. Now, what is a fast battleship? Well, clues in the name, but when you look at the arguments for why Hood is a fast battleship, for example, it's one of the major reasons is she has the same armament as the prior battleships. The battleships she's been designed to operate with, either Queen Elizabeth the Revenger, she has 8 15-inch guns, so do they. One of the biggest hallmarks of the German battlecruisers, however, is that they don't. As in keeping with most battlecruisers, they either have the same caliber of armament as the contemporary battleships, but less, or they also have smaller guns. Bearing in mind that only von der Tann, until the Der Flingers, actually shares an armament with her contemporary battleship class. So the von der Tanns share 11-inch guns with the Nassaus, but Moltke, Goeben and Seydlitz retain the 11-inch gun, whilst their battleship counterparts in terms of build time are all armed with 12-inch guns. Then the Koenigs very slightly predate the Der Flingers, and they both have 12-inch. And then the Baden-Bayern class just immediately postdates the Der Flingers, and of course they move up to 15-inch. So, fast battleships in World War II, almost everything built in the 1930s and into the Second World War is a fast battleship, but they all have battleship scales of armament, both in terms of caliber and number of guns, and the German battlecruisers don't. Even the Der Flingers, which are the last of the German battlecruisers, whilst they are matching the Königs, they have one less pair of guns on the broadside, and that's if you accept that they are the contemporaries of the Königs. Even though the Königs start work the year before them, you can make an equal argument that perhaps they're the contemporaries of the Bardens and Bayerns, which start work a year after them. Although, to be fair, the argument is probably slightly stronger for the Königs, but if you do, for whatever reason, argue that they're contemporaries of the Bardens and Bayerns, then the matter gets even worse, because while they now both, yes, have 8 guns, one has 12-inch, one has 15-inch. So they fall down, I think, on the armament side of things, definitely. And the other thing is also protection. Now, yes, people do go on and on about how the German battlecruisers are very heavily protected, and yes, that is true to a certain extent. However, they are not as well protected as the German battleships. And this is, a fairly major issue. Because, again, when looking at Hood, one of the strong arguments for why Hood is a fast battleship is because her armour protection is equivalent to the protection of the contemporary battleships in her own navy. Now, she does have 12-inch armour, but it's inclined to give equivalent protection to the 13-inch slab armour of the Queen Elizabeths. But when you look at the German battlecruisers, whilst, yes, as I said, they are better protected than the British ones that are their contemporary with, Von der Tann, fraction under 10 inches of armour compared to the Helgolands, Moltke and Goeben, 11 inches of armour, as compared to the armour that you're going to find on something like, say, a Kaiser class. The same with Seydlitz, and then obviously the Seydlitz has 12 inches of armour, again compared to a Kaiser class. It's not the world's most favourable comparison. And then you have a look at the König class, and then the Königs compared to the Der Flingers. The Der Flingers, once again, just a fraction under 12 inches of armour. The Königs considerably better protected. So whilst they might have the same kind of protection as, well, to be honest, once they get up to 12 inches of protection, they've got similar protection to some of the very earliest dreadnoughts in other nations. That doesn't mean that they have battleship levels of protection. It means they have heavier than average battlecruiser levels of protection, because when you look at the technological advances and differences between something like the Der Flinger and something like Dreadnought, for example, well, the fact that Der Flinger has a slightly thicker main armour belt is more of a product of the technological advance, not the fact that she suddenly morphed into a battleship. And the other point with armour is also the scale of the armour. If you compare the Königs and the Der Flingers, for example, the main belt is actually shallower on the Der Flingers than it is on the Königs. So even if the Königs and the Der Flingers had the same thickness of main belt, and obviously they don't, the Königs still have a more extensive area of their sides protected by the primary thickness of the main belt. And this holds true if you look across pretty much most battleships. Their area covered by the main armour plate is greater than that on even on German battlecruisers. So they don't have the same kind of armour coverage. They don't have the same thickness as the contemporaries from their own fleet. They don't have the same level of firepower as battleships from their own fleet. The only thing they have is speed, at which point, less armour, fewer guns, or slightly weaker guns, or both, but faster, they're still battlecruisers. They're just a slightly different mix of speed, protection, and firepower compared to other battlecruisers. They don't tick any of the boxes for fast battleships if you actually look into it closely. Yites331 asks, do you think that Popov's rounded ships could have had promise if that line of thinking had been more thoroughly explored? The Levardia's problems seemed to come more from her flat bottom than her rounded design, and her stability and manoeuvrability didn't come at the cost of speed or efficiency. Yes, I think they could. Now, obviously, some people do deride them, but I tend to agree more with Steve McLaughlin's interpretation of them, which was that they had faults, but they were actually fairly reasonable coastal defence ships. So, for the period, i.e. the late 19th century, if you were a country with extensive coastlines and the need for basically harbour defence / coastal defence craft carrying very heavy guns on a minimum possible investment, i.e. the kind of countries who in the 20th century would buy coast defence battleships instead of full-size battleships, something like Popov's rounded ships, with a few fixes to address some of the faults primarily around the propulsion and the positioning of the propellers, definitely wouldn't have been too bad an investment. You can get some pretty nasty, hefty weapons on them for a very low price hull-wise. The main thing you're going to have to be paying for is they're not going to be particularly fast. So that's why I said kind of harbour defence as much as coastal defence. But the thing is, at that point, for the relatively small size of them, you could probably afford to have one or two defending each of your major harbours rather than fewer coastal defence ships that have to wander up and down the coast to do the job. And then, of course, if you know where the enemy's coming, you can concentrate a much greater force. So that they definitely had potential, but were perhaps a little bit too unorthodox for most people to pay attention to, and the flaws that the original designs had did kind of overshadow them, even if they were somewhat exaggerated. Drake Marvel asks, did a pirate ever have a ship of the line? Talking first or second rate, something that almost anything else would hesitate to face. At the time of the ship of the line, no pirate did. Basically because it would have been far too large an investment and far too difficult to maintain. So with smaller ships, you could careen them on beaches to clean them. You could pretend to be a merchant ship. You could sneak in and out of ports relatively unannounced. And you didn't need an absolutely massive crew. With a first rate, you need a full-scale dockyard to help maintain the ship. You are not disguising yourself in any way, shape or form as a merchant vessel. People are going to notice you, whatever port you go into. And you're going to need 500, 600, 800 men to run the ship. Which, let's just say most pirate organisations didn't have quite that amount of sway. One or two did manage to run pirate fleets that had that many or more men in them, but not all in one place. So the logistics of trying to run a ship of the line for a pirate at the time that ships of the line were definitely a thing, it's just a step above and beyond. The biggest pirate ships of that period got up to the level of about a fairly significant fifth-rate frigate, but even they were relatively rare and usually armed with slightly smaller weapons than a large fifth-rate in naval service would. Now, if you go further back, before the ship of the line, to consider maybe the medieval period, getting into the Tudor period of, did pirates at that point have ships that could be categorised as front-line heavy warships, even though the ship of the line term hadn't quite been invented at that point? Then yes, at that point they did. Especially prior to the age of gunpowder, where whether or not you were a frontline warship basically depended on how large was your ship, and the bigger ships were merchant ships, and how many armed people did you have on board. And then as you transition into the era of the gun-armed warship, well, people like Drake, Hawkins and Raleigh officially are privateers. The Spanish would call them pirates, but they also call the entire country of England heretics, so, their judgment may be slightly biased. But if you're looking in terms of non-uniformed, non-naval service personnel running around, taking merchant ships and so forth in a vessel that is heavily armed and large enough to stand off against almost any opposition, i.e. frontline warship basically, then yes, in the kind of Tudor, early Stuart period, there definitely were pirates or privateers who had such vessels to hand. Brendan Buersdorf asks, were there any major differences between ships of the line built by various countries? Did any of them build them in a way that made them stand out particularly, or were they for the most part all roughly comparable? Yes, there were some differences. First, there's aesthetic differences. The exact shaping of the sterns and the bows did tend to have certain national characteristics on first rates that made it relatively easy to identify at least the origin, if not necessarily the flag that the particular ship would be flying at any given time. Plus, well, generally speaking, British first rates outside of Sovereign of the Seas tended towards being slightly smaller than most for the majority of the age of sail. So when you look at Royal Sovereign, Victory, Royal George, etc., Princess Charlotte, they're all kind of 100, 104 gun ships. They're just about first rates by the rating system, and they tend to be a fraction shorter and a little bit beamier than some of their competitors, which is a trend that holds true across most of British warships at the time. Whereas in the classic high age of sail, the French and the Spanish are the two biggest opposition fleets. The Russians have a reasonably large fleet as well, and of course the Americans come in with a single first rate towards the end. But looking at the people who have the most first rates apart from the British, i.e., let's say France and Spain, the French and the Spanish ships tend to be larger overall and somewhat more heavily armed. The Spanish, once they get back into the idea of building first rates, they really love the 112 gunner. And Santissima Trinidad is kind of a one-off. Then you've got the French, who they do build a series of 110 gunners, so again bigger than the British ones, roughly comparable to the Spanish 112s, but then they go for the Océan class of 118, 120, 122, 124 gunners, depending on exactly which ship you're looking at and what time you're looking at. So the French have the largest, apart from the one off Santissima Trinidad, but overall the French have the largest first rates, then the Spanish, then the British, and as I said, the French and Spanish ones, especially the French ones, will tend to be somewhat longer for their beam compared to the British ones outside of aesthetics. The other thing is that at least until the 19th century, where you're kind of seeing the end of the sailing ship of the line anyway, but during the classic period, the 17th and 18th century, whilst the British are pretty good at manufacturing third rates and below in large class numbers, they're actually pretty terrible at manufacturing anything like a consistent first rate. So they have all sorts of first rates built as one-offs and two-offs and things like this. The first really major class of first rate that gets going in terms of major production in the classic age of sail is the Caledonias, which are basically enlarged Victories, and that is, again, early 19th century. Whereas the French especially kind of managed to get a production line going, not a specific single production line, but the Océan class is the Océan class for a reason. There's an awful lot of them. The Spanish 112 gunners are also relatively consistent, but not as much as the Océans. It is one of these slight paradoxes of late 17th and into the 18th and early 19th century age of sail designs, in that, speed issues in terms of length to beam ratios aside, whilst the British will have an advantage in a number of specific technologies like coppering the ships, the invention of carronades, mass manufacture of things like pulley blocks and such, in terms of the actual ship design itself, as well as the ability to produce large numbers of them, the French are actually very good. And that's why they're constantly competing with the British during that period. The Spanish have kind of gradually started falling behind since their empire started to diminish. But the French are very much on a level with just with a slight issue of the fact that obviously the British have more of an emphasis on their navy than the French do, because they also have a large land army. And then the revolution comes along and hamstrings the French navy, which is, as I've said before on the channel, why the British are so happy to get their hold on French ships whenever they can, because they're usually pretty good ships, endurance issues aside, and can obviously do a lot better once they're crewed by a bunch of people who aren't worried about being guillotined for speaking out of turn. Thomas Dudkiewicz asks, can you talk a bit about the Lofoten Raids? Why they were undertaken, did they achieve their goals, and do you think they were worth it for the Allies? So the Lofoten Raids, or more correctly the series of raids, about a dozen or so in the immediate vicinity of the area of Lofoten, were a bunch of operations undertaken by British, what we would today call special forces, with a variety of objectives. The ostensible direct objectives were varied and sometimes can seem on the surface to make not a tremendous amount of sense. So one of the early ones, which you can see here, which was aimed at destroying a fish oil and glycerin factory, which, yeah, okay, you might think that's a bit odd, but, that those are actually fairly important war materials in that time period. It had a relatively clear military objective to deny the Germans the access to these resources and the ability to produce them, but it also had another objective which is not so obvious. It's not a direct military, we're here to blow this thing up objective. Part of the objective was to force the Germans to deploy troops to Norway and vehicles, aircraft, etc. Because the British didn't have any real intention, Churchill aside, of invading Norway, and so the more German troops were in Norway, the fewer German troops there were in places they did want to invade, like France or Germany itself. And in that respect, it worked. Later on, they would, as I say, other raids would go on to target other targets with some military application in terms of logistics, and others in terms of just taking out radio transmitters, sinking small boats, basically annoying and irritating the Germans, plus also allowing them to bring supplies to the Norwegian resistance and take Norwegians who wanted to continue the war in a more conventional manner away back to the UK so that they could sign up for the Free Norwegian Armed Forces. But the overall goal in terms of the larger strategic objective does seem to have worked, because by the end of the war there were over 1/3 Germans in Norway who were accomplishing basically nothing. The sum total grand effort of the German garrison in Norway was, in terms of warfighting, nothing at all. Obviously, the Luftwaffe deployments right up north to attack the convoys going to Russia did have an effect, but those would have been deployed there anyway. Likewise, the Kriegsmarine deployments to Norway, they're probably about the best they could do at the time. But there's no need, even if you're deploying significant numbers of Luftwaffe aircraft far north and Kriegsmarine ships to the west coast, there's no need to have 370 odd thousand army personnel in Norway as well. But a mixture of things, including the series of commando raids, did convince Hitler and German High Command that the Allies must have wanted something more out of Norway than they actually did, and it was probably worth it all around, because it meant the Allies had 1/3 fewer Germans to fight, which made their victory somewhat easier, and it meant that at least for the Germans, they had 1/3 plus personnel who managed to come home at the end of the war, rather than 1/3 extra casualties, or however many that would have added up to. Matt Kidd asks, through context, I think I've figured out that spotting carrier aircraft is the process of getting them armed and ready to launch. Is this correct? And why is it called this? And has this usage ever gotten confused with the more common one, as aircraft are both spotted and spot things in the more common usage? So close. An aircraft can be spotted for launch, but the act of spotting a carrier aircraft is actually the act of putting it in its correct position on the carrier. Now, that can be the correct position for storage in the hangar. It can be the correct position for getting it ready in the hangar, it can be the correct position for storing it or preparing it on the deck, making it ready on the deck, or indeed the correct position on an elevator, or the correct position on a catapult for launch, or in the case of early ships without catapult, the correct position for launch. So the short version is that carrier spotting is quite literally the act of placing the aircraft in the correct spot for its particular, or location, for the particular activity that needs to be undertaken with the aircraft at that time. As for why it's called spotting, sources differ. There are some, albeit far from all, who suggest that on some of the very earliest carriers, when they were operating pretty much the same aircraft for their entire air group, there were literally painted spots on the deck. So it was like, okay, this aircraft goes here, that aircraft goes there, that aircraft goes there, and so on. But even those sources disagree as to whether it was a single spot or whether it was, two spots, one for each of the primary wheels on the landing gear, and so on and so forth. But those minority of sources all seem to think it was some kind of visual indicator of, put aircraft here. Now, of course, as time goes on and you get multiplicities of aircraft on aircraft carriers, whether that be torpedo bombers, scouts, fighters, later dive bombers, and so on and so forth, having a fixed system of, all of these aircraft go here, here, and here is impossible, because on a daily basis you might have different numbers of aircraft available of different types, and you might want different types of aircraft up on deck. If you're spotting for a combat air patrol launch, or are you spotting for an anti-carrier strike, etc., etc. So if there was a visual reference system of any sort back in the day, it was certainly gone by the middle of the interwar period, but the term stuck around, whatever its origins. Now, in terms of has that ever gotten confused? Generally, in general conversation, yes, it is very easy to confuse, but usually in terms of carrier operations, the context is the key. So if you say, well, I've got this aircraft spotted on deck or in the hangar, that makes it fairly clear what you mean, as opposed to there is an aircraft I have spotted in the sky, or incoming aircraft spotted, because, again, context suggests that this is not an aircraft that is actually on the deck or in the hangar. So, yeah, in military parlance, in day-to-day activities, I think confusion is probably fairly minimal, but when you're talking about it generally without explaining it further, then yes, it is possible to get quite confused occasionally. Matthew Jones asks, can you tell us a bit more about the sinking of HMS Victoria? It seems amazing to me that it sits vertical on the seafloor even 100 years after the sinking. Was the hull particularly strong? Well, the sinking of HMS Victoria by HMS Camperdown is something that still excites naval historians to quite acrimonious debate even today as to exactly why it happened. Well, the why of why did it sink is fairly obvious. Camperdown rammed it, there was a socking great hole in the side, and some of the bulkhead doors didn't work properly, so down it went. But why Camperdown ended up ramming her, and whose fault it was, is the thing that everybody argues about. Now, I will be doing a full video for a Wednesday video about the whole incident at some point in the future, but the brief is, at least in my opinion, and again, say this is my opinion, it's the opinion of a reasonable body of historians, but as I said, there's some fairly acrimonious debate about it, so others will possibly violently disagree with this assessment, is that Admiral Tryon was attempting to break the Royal Navy of its habit that it had developed in the 1880s and 1890s of being far more obey the letter of the order, don't think for yourself, be a good little answerable officer to the Admiral, than the Nelsonian ideal of a free-thinking captain who would interpret the orders of the Admiral in terms of what do the Admiral want to accomplish, as opposed to following strictly exactly how the Admiral was necessarily indicating that was to be done. And my assessment of that is based partly on the fact that immediately before the exercises that ended in Victoria's sinking, Tryon explicitly passed notes to the various captains in his fleet that effectively spelt out, in as close as it was to be possible while still maintaining politeness, if the orders don't make sense, try to execute the spirit of the orders, not the letter of them. And then, during the exercises, he ordered these two columns to merge, but he ordered it in a way that would bring the two columns into collision rather than merge. And, at least as far as I can see, this was basically his test, because he was probably thinking no one would be absolutely stupid enough to follow the Admiral's orders so close to the letter they end up smashing into another Royal Navy capital ship. So they'll have to take the spirit of the order, i.e. I want everyone to merge into a single column, over the exact navigational instructions I've just given. And it turns out he was perhaps thinking a little bit too highly of the captain of the Camperdown, who promptly swung his ship in a beautiful arc straight into the side of HMS Victoria, and down she went. Unfortunately, taking Admiral Tryon with her. If his attempts had actually succeeded, and people had begun to think for themselves a little bit earlier, who knows, we might have had a slightly different outcome for some major battles in World War I. Nevertheless, HMS Victoria, as you mentioned, sank by the bow, because that's where the damage was, and embedded herself in the seabed vertically, and has pretty much stayed there ever since. Now, as far as was her hull particularly strong, she's a Victorian-era ship, so by and large, these things are built to last. SS Great Britain and HMS Warrior, both also examples of Victorian ironclad and, well, in Victoria's case, compound-clad engineering, and just how durable that stuff is. The Great Eastern as well, the amount of damage she took in her life and how difficult she was to break up at the end is, again, it's a good example of just how durable they were able to make those things back in the day. And, well, apart from anything else, she's got an 18-inch thick belt. That's a lot of solid material that's supporting probably a good chunk of the rest of the hull. So it's a combination of, yes, she's probably, by modern standards, massively overbuilt in certain areas, especially in terms of physical strength, but also just her design generally, even without the Victorian levels of over-engineering, was a pretty compact and solid mass of material with relatively little extraneous lightweight superstructure and so forth. So it's not necessarily that surprising from an engineer's perspective that she's still quite happily sitting in the seabed. Togfather asks, after dropping down to 12-pounder secondary guns with Dreadnought, the Royal Navy reverted to 4-inch secondaries on its battleships and battlecruisers, increasing to 6-inch for Tiger, the Iron Dukes, the QEs and the Revengers. Then, for some reason, they went to 444s on the Renowned, Courageous and Glorious, and in a similar time frame they looked at the 5.5-inch guns from two cruisers that were being built for Greece that had been purchased at the outbreak of World War I, the Chester and Birkenhead, decided they liked them and put those same guns, or copies thereof, on Hood, Furious and Hermes. And then they went back to 6-inch for the G3 and N3 designs, actually using them on the Nelsons before making the move to dual-purpose guns for new builds and modernizations in the 1930s. What prompted them to dabble with the two different sub-6-inch calibers, one of which was only fitted to 5 ships, and why were both then abandoned post-World War I? Basically, it's the rise of the displacement of destroyers, and therefore commensurately their increase in size. Back when Dreadnought was being considered, the most likely opponent obviously was Germany, and the largest class of ship that they had in production at the time was the S-90 class, which the Germans were still calling a torpedo boat, which was about 400 tons unloaded. By the time that they were, around about the time actually that Dreadnought was being constructed, the Germans then went on to the S-138 class, which started out at about 550 and went up to 700 tons. So, it's a larger vessel, it's going to need more hitting to make it stop, and hence going up from a 12-pounder to a 4-inch makes a certain amount of sense. However, obviously the Germans didn't stop developing their attack craft. The They then went on to develop the 1911 and 1913 types, which by the time you get to the 1913 types, are pushing 1,000 tons, and you can see a few of them in various pictures up with lesser craft, and the size difference is quite marked. So now they're larger ships still. So at this point, you now need to think about, okay, well, we need an even bigger gun to stop them, and that being now is the 6-inch. And then as you go through World War One, you've got the Germans now building 1,400 ton destroyers, and other navies are now also building ships that are destroyers that are in the mid-thousands, possibly even pushing up towards the upper end of the thousands, but maybe close to, but not a few prototypes, not even quite breaking 2,000 ton. And so the need for secondary batteries increasing in caliber goes up yet again. So the 5.5 is a larger weapon than the 4, but can still fire fairly quickly, can hit fairly hard, and the 6-inch is an even bigger gun than that and can hit even harder. Plus, once you get into the kind of 5.5, 6-inch category, they're also looking at, weirdly enough, almost a semi-pre-dreadnought style role of, well, at medium to close ranges might actually be useful for engaging enemy capital ships to do disruptive damage, or also, fighting off incoming cruisers, which have also been getting considerably larger during this time period. The 4.4-inch is a bit of a weird diversion in that around about the time they're considering it, they are, although 6-inch guns have been notionally quick firing for quite some time, the rate of fire difference between a 4-inch and a 6-inch, or a 4-inch and a 5.5, is relatively considerable. One of the attractions of the 5.5 is that it is just that little bit faster firing than the 6-inch, as well as obviously weighs somewhat less. And they're then looking at, well, with the 6-inch guns being larger and not able to fire as often, a single hit will be more likely to stop a torpedo boat or a destroyer, fair enough. But the chances of us getting that hit are diminishing because we have fewer guns. So the 4.4 was an attempt to kind of square the circle of going, okay, well, we can try and combine the rate of fire of the 4-inch, but by putting it in a triple mount, we can have the weight of fire of a larger gun or a battery of larger guns. And because there'll be so many of these triple mounts, then we'll be in a really good shape because there'll be so many shells going out there that even if a 4-inch shell won't stop a destroyer with 1 or 2 hits these days, that may not matter quite so much because we're going to hit them with so many 4-inch shells. And then they went and completely messed up the design of the 4.4-inch mount, so it didn't work anything close to advertised, or indeed initially at all. And so they very quickly dropped that idea. Basically, triple gun mountings don't work for rapid fire unless you have huge amounts of space to play with and or autoloaders, and the 4.4-inch mount had neither of those. And then you get into the 1920s, at which point dual-purpose weaponry is still not quite a thing, so the 6-inch gun is now able to fire relatively rapidly. It has a degree of anti-cruiser role as well as an anti-destroyer role, and as we mentioned, in certain circumstances, possibly also a minor anti-capital ship role. It's big enough and mean enough to be stuck in twin turrets, which obviously afford many advantages over casemates. And since there's no perceived need for dual-purpose AA mountings, it sticks around as, Nelson and Rodney's secondary armament, and indeed is the planned secondary armament of a number of interwar battleship designs prior to King George V's. But as the air threat grows more and more and dual-purpose mounts become more and more viable, the 6-inch is just too heavy a shell to be able to manage quickly enough for AA use when you're manually handling the thing. And so that goes away, the 5.25 and the 4.5 come in, and, well, as I've said before, when it comes to destroyer caliber weaponry, this whole issue of rapid fire versus weight of shell is something that the Royal Navy is still arguing about going into the Second World War. It's just now they're arguing mostly in terms of anti-aircraft and dual-purpose mountings rather than purely anti-surface. Gregory Albert asks, what was the ideal pirate ship during the Golden Age of Piracy, and what realistic chance did a small fleet of similar ships have against a frigate, a third-rate, or even a first-rate? So, in the Golden Age of Piracy, assuming we're talking, literal Pirates of the Caribbean - Atlantic, a lot of the considerations as to, why you wouldn't have a pirate first rate, which was answered near the beginning of the Drydock, kind of apply to when you're selecting your best ship. So it's not just the most firepower. As a pirate vessel, you need to be fast, because you need to overhaul your targets, and also ideally to be able to outrun or at least keep ahead of people who are hunting you long enough for them to give up and go home. So you need a fast vessel. It's then got to be large enough to either carry the stolen cargo, or to carry enough men to form basically an impromptu prize crew if you're going to sail both ships away. You've got to have enough armament to overcome your intended targets, i.e. merchant vessels, and merchant vessels are armed, so you do have to carry a reasonable amount of armament. But you also don't want to have too many guns, because A, you might be considered too much of a threat and attract unwanted warship attention, and B, that all costs money and time to maintain. It needs men to man them, and of course every gun that you carry on your ship is taking up a couple of tons or more of weight that could be better put to use transporting your ill-gotten gains. So there is a bit of a balance to it all. The other thing is that merchant ships generally tend to carry guns that are somewhat lighter than the guns you'll find in naval sea service. So a rated ship, even a 6th rate, will usually be carrying 12-pounders, maybe for a 6th rate 18-pounders, definitely 18-pounders for the most part on 5th rates. There'll be the odd 9-pounder around, but it'll only be the unrated ships that are primarily 9-pounders or less. And merchant ships tend to have 6 or 9-pounders, or maybe even 3-pounders. So, whilst it might be tempting to have more firepower to see off the odd warship, etc., the fact is that unless you want to pay for it, you're going to find it fairly difficult to find the heavier calibers of cannonball and the larger quantities of gunpowder that you need for those bigger guns. And as a pirate, of course, you don't want to have to pay for things. You want to be able to just take things. So it actually makes more sense at that point to have a similar armament to the merchant ships that you might be attacking, i.e. 6-pounders, 9-pounders, maybe the odd 12-pounder, because then as part of your ransacking of the ship, you can take all of their ammunition and their gunpowder for free, and then you don't have to pay for replacements, which is always good. And also, if any of your guns have burst, etc., you can take some of their guns. So your ideal pirate vessel is probably something armed with 18 to 30 lightweight 6 and 9-pounder guns, maybe a few 12-pounders here and there. Has to be pretty quick, not too large, again, not to draw too much obvious attention and not to need too many men. Ideally, you want it to be either a converted merchant vessel or a vessel that can be readily adapted to look like a merchant vessel, because you want to be able to slip in and out of ports in quote-unquote disguise for a lot of the time. And as a result, you're not actually going to stand too much of a chance against a full-on warship, except unless it's a very, very small one. I mean, yeah, sure, a sloop or a brig you might just about be able to see off, but anything that's actually a rated vessel, probably not. A small fleet of those, on the other hand, if you have, say, half a dozen such vessels, yeah, you could quite easily stand off a 6th rate. You might start to struggle against a decently built 5th rate that shows up with a lot of 18-pounders, and if a 3rd rate or a 1st rate comes along, then your only real hope is to hope that everybody shares a similar kamikaze spirit and will just swarm and mob and try and board the ship, which still might end badly, but that's probably about your best chance with a bunch of ships armed with, on average, 9-pounders against a ship that's toting maybe a gun deck of 24 or 32-pounders on the lower deck, plus, a second gun deck, or in the first, if it's a case of a 1st rate, a 3rd gun deck plus deck guns. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Assuming that everything is going to plan, around about the time that this goes up for regular release, I'll probably either be sitting in an airport or possibly on a plane heading back to the UK from what has hopefully been a very successful Canada trip to alight back upon British soil on Monday, i.e. the day after this goes on general public release. So hopefully that's all gone well, but who knows, I can't see into the future, so I'm uploading this in hope. And one other thing, as you might have noticed, there is a little competition going to be happening. Now, admittedly, okay, it's not exactly the world's greatest amount of notice. I apologise for that, and many of you may have already made your own arrangements, but from the 24th to the 26th of June 2022, which is only in a couple of weeks' time at the time of release, there is Tankfest going on in Bovington in Dorset in England. So I'm going to be there on the Friday and the Sunday. I do, however, have a pair of tickets for the Friday also available. So if you happen to want to go to Tankfest and you have the means to get there, but perhaps up until now you maybe haven't been able to afford the tickets, or maybe I don't know, they've sold out or something. But in any case, if you want to go to Tankfest and you'd like to go on the Friday, then drop me a line via Discord DM or email, and within 2 or 3 days of this video going public release, I will pick a couple of people, not necessarily entirely strictly at random, but I will pick a couple of people mostly at random to receive those tickets for free. And, well, if you happen to run into me while you're there, then, well, sucks to be you, I guess. So much the better for me, but you have to put up with me talking about tanks as well as ships, or pointing out all the various guns on various tanks that came from ships. Anyway, it'll be a fun day. So there's the opportunity for you. Again, apologise for the late notice, but such is life. Bye now.